2024 was the most expensive election in history. So what? Americans spent $15 billion in political spending this year. We spent more on fast food last year, 13 times more. When will that stop? Unregulated campaign finance law only puts power and control into the hands of the few. Poppycock. Citizens United destroyed democracy by allowing the rich and powerful to control elections. Hogwash. America, we've been lied to about money in politics. We've been taught to be scared about something that's actually very beneficial in our day-to-day life. That is the right to be able to speak and the right to be able to associate and share our political views. When we get right down to it, I want to propose to you a somewhat more radical idea, and that is Americans really aren't all that worried about money in politics. After all, we spend 4.5 times more per year on video games. We spend some 20 times more on coffee, $363 billion a year. And I'll tell you what, the average American gets more worked up about a bad cup of coffee than he does about any political scandal or political spending issue that we might find out there. At the end of the day, money in politics is actually trivial, and our attention goes to where things are that are important. So let's look at some of the truths about money in politics and get to the bottom of some of these myths. So one of the truths that we need to get to the bottom of is the fact that money by itself doesn't buy elections, doesn't buy votes. It's a great study by a group of MIT scholars that examined if you take sophisticated firms, groups like national defense contractors who have everything to gain by maximizing their political contributions, their political spending, it would make sense in the reporting to see that they spent massive amounts of money, up to the legal amounts for each firm, each market segment. But the proof there shows that they don't engage in that. What money tends to do is to allow you to have some sort of access to politicians, but there's no evidence that supports that it somehow buys elections. We can kind of look to a couple examples for obvious support of this. One example is looking to Jeb Bush when he ran in 2016, spending $100 million of his family's own money. And this was the man who had to ask audiences to applaud him.
Please clap.
We can look at Bloomberg running in 2020 in the Democratic primary and spending $1 billion with a B of his own money. When you're unpopular or the cause that you're presenting just doesn't resonate with the American people, money by itself is not somehow magical or corrupting, and it won't change the outcome of an election. Another problem with campaign finance law is that it's designed with an effort to try to protect against political insiders exercising corrupt acts, but it winds up actually being a very complicated system of government accounting rules with requirements to register and report with the government. And it oftentimes has the effect of driving grassroots groups out of political participation. So think about it. If you're the small Planned Parenthood organization or a small gun rights group and you want to engage in advocacy, and suddenly you're facing loads of forms and complicated rules, it's going to be much more difficult for you to get into politics. It makes politics a professional sport rather than making it accessible to everyone else. And you think about this principle as well. Someone like Jeff Bezos or Mark Cuban, they can afford a guy like me. They can go to big law. They can go to a boutique law firm and hire attorneys who bill at expensive rates every hour. It does nothing to stop the wealthy and powerful from getting their message out or engaging in politics. But I'll tell you what, campaign finance law is incredibly effective at shutting down citizen engagement. So one example is, unfortunately, a failed lawsuit I brought against the Federal Election Commission by a group that called itself Free Speech. It wanted to run a series of advertisements, and it wanted an advisory opinion from the commission, asking the commissioners there, the top experts in the land, whether their advertisements were regulated and had to go through the maze of FEC rules and compliance requirements, or whether they were free and protected by the First Amendment. Here's an ad that they wanted to run, and the FEC couldn't give an answer about. President Obama opposes the Government Litigation Savings Act. This is a tragedy for Wyoming ranchers and a boon to Obama's environmentalist cronies. Obama cannot be counted on to represent Wyoming values and voices as president. This November, call your neighbors, call your friends, talk about ranching. Looking at that ad, the FEC was unable to give advice, so it leaves grassroots groups with a shrug. And violation of the law carries hefty civil penalties, in some instances criminal penalties, and it causes a real First Amendment injury for these sorts of organizations. Another problem that we have with campaign finance law is it has an absurd reach no matter where it goes. It gets more complicated over time, and it entangles people in trivial violations of the law. So here's a couple examples. The first is looking at Dinesh D'Souza. He gave somewhere around $10,000 to different friends of his to be able to support Wendy Long when she ran for Senate. Now, the Department of Justice spent considerable funds to bring him to trial and to work this case through. For small amounts of money for a relatively unknown candidate for office. And this all is supposedly in the name of saving democracy and keeping elections clean. At the same time, we can go back to John Edwards and the DOJ investigation of him as well. The issue there was that he purportedly paid his mistress to be part of his campaign team. And the question was whether electing to use your mistress in your campaign was a prohibited use of donor money for personal use, or whether it was an allowable campaign expenditure. And Mr. Edwards was found innocent on some of the charges, and the jury came to a deadlock on others. But considerable money and time was spent in doing this. This is like comparably if the police were to use SWAT teams to go after people who were just on the edge of a crosswalk and maybe jaywalking. So the problems with these laws is we expend time, government resources in the name of supposedly cleaning up elections, but for rather trivial issues. And the question has to be whether we want to spend our time and our efforts in doing so, or whether that energy could be spent more wisely in other areas. So another example is the so-called hush money case against President Trump. This is an interesting situation where a New York prosecutor used an interesting hook in New York law to try to show that President Trump violated actually federal campaign finance law. This was allegedly done by falsifying business records about a non-disclosure agreement with Stormy Daniels. Now, the judge there, interestingly, barred most of the testimony from an expert witness, Brad Smith, who was the former chairman, former commissioner of the Federal Election Commission, who was to testify that the hook that you needed in federal campaign finance law for the purpose of influencing an election means something very specific, in that you couldn't extend the reasoning of the law to capture what was going on in President Trump's situation, just as you couldn't do the same in Senator Edwards' situation. Now, when we think about campaign finance law, what we're thinking about is somehow preventing against corruption and saving America, bringing fairness and cleanness to the political process, not these sort of soap opera situations involving mistresses or non-disclosure agreements or hush money cases. And that's what campaign finance so often becomes, an adventure into this frivolity, into trivialness, and it's a tremendous waste of our resources while damaging the right of people's freedom to be able to associate and get together for political causes. What's the alternative to everything that we've been talking about? Well, we already have anti-corruption laws that are in place. They stop bribery. They stop what we call quid pro quo, or like tit for tat exchanges, asking people to pass a law if you give them money. So the very worst of instances we're already protecting against in the law. We have government ethics provisions that They're not perfect, but they go a long way to protecting these sort of core interests that everyone thinks campaign finance laws do. We also see enforcement of this on a regular basis. One of the most famous cases involving this is the Abscam investigation from the late 70s and early 80s from the FBI, where a number of congressmen were indicted because they did take bribes and they did violate federal laws on this against corruption. But what campaign finance laws seem to do, or are best at doing, is preventing challengers from being able to get enough money and resources to come in and be able to shake up the status quo. It wraps average citizens and activist groups in red tape, and it makes it difficult to engage the political process. I don't think that's any system that we want to promote or laud in a democratic society. And I think that we really need to focus on strengthening true anti-corruption laws, true anti-bribery laws, as well as their enforcement, rather than using what we think of as prophylactic or preventative measures that really do more harm to the democratic process than not.